We are so excited to welcome Claire Field Petersen to our amazing quilting lesson. That it is so fundamental to the history of our country, to the history of our world, and she's going to take us on a grand journey. So we welcome Claire Petersen for Quiddity of Quilting.
Quiddity means, how do we turn this on? Am I good? I'm on. I have to begin with a negative, so please allow this for a moment. Last Thursday, 7:30 a.m., I'm on the computer. I'm heading for the internet, and instantly my computer completely freezes. A ear-splitting sound is screeching out of my computer. Up comes Microsoft Windows security alert. Phone this phone number immediately. So I phoned the phone number. And within 30 minutes, they had taken complete control of my computer. They had gotten into my banking account. I had to go down and change all of my numbers. I've had to take my computer over to Geek Squad to have it completely scrubbed clean because it got compromised. In telling this to a few others, I just found that my nephew in California had this happen to him 2 weeks ago. My 13-year-old granddaughter back in Virginia had this happen to her a week ago. And just last night, someone told me that they got into her bank account and took upwards of $150,000. So, dear people, what I should have done, and nobody bothered to tell me, so I'm telling you, that was a scam. What I should have done was push the off button and held it for 10 seconds. If I had just flipped it off, the person would have still been connected and been able to continue to have access to all of my online banking, etc. So I need you to know, AI has arrived. It has the ability to take a picture of you, to replicate your voice, to falsify messages to your loved ones. Be very conscious of what you're doing, what you're sharing online. For all the good, there always has to be an opposition in all things, okay? So enough of that. That's my negative for the moment. Now let's begin. I am thrilled to be here because this is 2026, and it is the very first potpourri of this year. And the new word for the year is semi-quincentennial. Everybody say semi-quincentennial. Put it together. Semi-quincentennial. What does it mean? It means 250. What are we celebrating the 4th of July? 250th year of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Just Sunday, as I was standing out in the hallway at my church, where a group of young people, I asked them if they knew what semi-quincentennial meant. No. Do you have any idea why we celebrate the 4th of July? No. Young, please, parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, contact your children and let them know. Between now and at least the 4th of July, we are going to be sharing the major, magnificent moments of history of this nation. And this is why each one of you, and I'm shaking my proverbial finger, you literally need to be writing your own history, because you will document things that other people don't feel to document. So please, I hope that you're all writing your life history, okay?
50th anniversary.
Pardon?
Our 50th anniversary in June.
She's going to the 50th anniversary in June. All right, let's begin with a Latin word. The Latin word is culcita. Everybody say culcita. Latin, it means stuffed sack, and it is the word for quilt. Now, you're a little bit smarter than you walked in the door a minute ago. Okay. I don't know how many of you are of the LDS persuasion, but on the 5th Sunday of this second hour in October, those of us in Utah were invited to participate in a video with D. Todd Christofferson and the area representatives for the LDS Church. And during that presentation of an hour, we were to recognize that the second coming of Jesus Christ is closer, and we are to understand how important it is that each one of us has been given specific gifts that we should be using to embellish our lives, but most specifically to help others. Well, two of the gifts that I have been given are creating quilts and genealogy research. I'm the avid historian. For my family, I have been doing research, etc., since I was 10 years of age, but most specifically for the last 26 years, and I have been making quilts for 62 years. And I'm thrilled to be able to come and share all of this with you today, because this easily could be my swan song. I have relatives who have spoken for my signature quilts, and they want them now. They don't want to wait till I pass away. I am 84 years of age. I do plan to live to be 105. Who knows how many more quilts, but it's time to move on, and so let's get with that. So let me tell you how genealogy connects with quilt making. As I've been doing my research, I came across Samuel Slater. He is a distant relative of mine, but guess what? He was born in England. He started working when he was 10 years of age. He became apprenticed at the age of 14, and he worked for 7 years in the cotton mill in England. He had a brilliant mind for looking at machinery and understanding how it worked. He camouflaged himself as a farmer and got on a ship knowing that America was offering greater opportunities. He could not take with him any blueprints, no written statements of anything that he knew about, because England did not want their secrets leaving their shores, but he was coming to America. He arrived here and by 1790, he had constructed, by memory, another cotton mill. It had 48 spindle spinning machinery. He operated it on the 20th of December, 1790 in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. It is the oldest piece of cotton machinery in America. It's still in existence, so I just had to put that on my to-do list to go visit it sometime. It was water-powered in order to run the textile mill. That is my distant relative, and most interesting that after he did this in 1790, he then married 2 years later, and his wife took up what he was interested in with all of this cotton processing, and so she became, her name was Hannah Wilkinson, she became the first woman to have a patent for invention of the double-ply cotton thread. How about that? And then he invited not just men to come and work in his factory, he wanted women there too and children. So he allowed them to build a small community around his factory, and he wanted to be a diligent, good overseer of all that. And so on Sunday in 1799, he started the first Sunday school. And look how long that's lasted, all the rest of these years, right? And during Sunday school, the children would be taught how to read and write. He was a great overseer. Now, moving on and a little bit closer to our age, I came across George Crowley. Crowley is my maiden name. Obviously, he has to be a relative. You will remember perhaps after World War I and all of this wonderful information that Linda Knight is giving us, many people came down with tuberculosis. And the patients had to have fresh air. The only problem was that during the night, as they were out in the fresh air, they were starting to get very cold. And so George Crowley figured out how to heat quilts. Okay? By 1940, and then heading into World War II, the pilots up in the air with Jimmy Stewart, etc., were cold. And so George Crowley figured out how to heat suits for the airplane pilots. And by 1946, the electric blanket was in the store, ready to be purchased for the big price of $39.50, which in that time period was very expensive. How many of you had electric blankets? How many of you still have electric blankets? Okay. All right. Interesting. And I just have to tell you that on December 7th, 1941, which is what happened? What happened on Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Pearl Harbor? My father arrived at the Sisters of Perpetual Help Hospital in Santa Maria, California, and said to my mother, "We can't afford twins. We're at war, but we'll take them anyway." And my twin brother and I were taken home from the hospital December 7th, 1941. So glad he took us home. Okay, now we have to step back in time for a couple of moments in order to understand the history of fabric that has come down through the ages. 30,000 years ago, flax was discovered. Now, flax is a spindly little weed, and they pulled it out and they included the root, and for whatever reason, somebody had the curiosity sufficient to process this and create flax. And from flax then morphed into linen. And it's been determined that Jesus Christ, when his body was taken off the cross, was wrapped up in linen. Go forward to 6000 BC, somebody figured out, let's shear the sheep. Let's take that interesting piece of dirty wool that's very oily, figure out how to clean it up, etc., and process thread and create wool fabric. Onward to 5000 BC. We have these interesting things called balls, B-O-L-L-S, on a plant. Who would have thought to pull that off, clean it up? This just came from a 300-year-old cotton plant that my neighbor just handed me yesterday. Great, I have to take it and show the elder class group that I'm presenting with. And from this came cotton. Is that amazing? I think that is phenomenal, okay? And so then you need to understand that from cotton, we then go to 3000 BC. There was an empress up on her balcony, and she's looking at her beautiful mulberry trees, and she wants to know what these creepy, crawling things are. And my goodness, it was a worm that created silk, and so we had silkworms. Now we have to jump forward to 1847, when Brigham Young marched into Salt Lake, okay? He determined that there was a need for the Mormon pioneers to produce their own fabric, and he wanted silk produced. Would you like to know that it takes 30,000 worms to produce 12 pounds of silk? And there was a woman by the name of Ann Clark right here in American Fork who was in charge of that project, and it came to be silk, okay? And then we have to jump all the way forward to 1941, because over there in another country, some chemists put together all these chemicals, and by 1945, just after World War II, polyester came on the market, and plastic came on the market. Can you see how fabric has come down through the centuries so that we could have a better life to live? Absolutely amazing. Well, you need to know that during all this time, women specifically were making quilts, because quilt making became a cottage industry because they had to take care of their three basic needs. The first basic need is food, which includes water. The second basic need that we have is shelter. And the third basic need that we have is clothing. We want to protect our bodies. We need something to cover ourselves. So I need you all to repeat after me. Blanket is one layer. Blanket is one layer. Coverlet is 2 layers. Coverlet is 2 layers. Quilt is 3 layers. Quilt is 3 layers. Now, jump forward to 1985. Some of you have received a piece of paper. You need to know that in 1985, I had the privilege of being in charge of the last convention that was put on at the Hotel Utah in Salt Lake City before they closed the doors and turned it into the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. We had over 2,000 people come from all over the nation and a few out of country. And for that specific event, I asked Lorraine Wilkinson to please write a song about quilting, because to my research, I had never found a song. So right now, you're now going to be my chorus, but we're only going to speak it because I'm not even allowed to sing in the shower. Okay, so pick up your piece of paper, share it. If there's another one, here we go. Just follow along with me. I love a quilting party, the friendship and the laughter, the fun in joining after with friends and family. I love a quilting party. I love creating patterns that tell a special story of history. There are crazy quilts and patchwork quilts and overall bill, the pinwheel and the windmill and even orange peel, the Lone Star and bursting star and Star of Bethlehem, the Star of David, the morning star, the sunburst and the fan. There's grandmother's flower garden and lovely rambling rose, the Irish chains, the king's crown, the wedding ring, and those like Jacob's ladder, the tulip and sunbonnet Sue, the crosses and the losses and log cabin too. And that isn't all. There's even one called Robbing Peter to Pay Paul. I love a quilting party and beautiful creations all through the many years. Let's give them cheers. Quilts are comfy, cozy on great-grandma's feather bed. They still are comfy, cozy on any bed, is said. I love a quilting party. I love a quilting bee. That's the place for me. You're welcome to keep that piece of paper or give it back to me. But now let's ask you a couple of questions. I had a little quilt quiz on that piece of paper. How many of you had a whoopee, a special blanket or quilt that you dragged around as a child? Good. How many of you slept under a handmade quilt? How many of you grew up under a quilt frame? Only a couple, okay. How many of you were given a hand-quilted quilt for a wedding gift? Okay, wonderful, good. Let's talk about quilt etiquette for one moment. If you still have a quilt, a treasured quilt, first of all, it cannot be stored in plastic. So if it is, you promise yourself you're going to run right home and get it out of plastic. Why? Plastic changes temperature every time our house gets hot and cold. It's actually causing, fabric is 40% moisture. It's causing the fabric to sweat and rot. If you put your winter clothes into a plastic garment bag, at least leave the zipper open so that it can air, okay? And most important, it's important to label your quilts, and we'll get into that in just a few minutes. Now, I gave similar presentation just Monday night to my empty nesters, and so I have to go back to, it was Martin Luther King Day, and in honor of that, I want to tell you something briefly about the South. This was, to me, absolutely amazing for me to learn about this. Let's jump back to 1793. Eli Whitney created the cotton engine. They shortened it to cotton gin. The South became the principal supplier of raw cotton because they had so many black slaves there who were willing to go out and pick these things. And this is difficult because it scars your arms, you bleed, it is very scratchy, okay? Let's back up first to how did we get slaves? I had to know that. I'd like to know the rest of the story. Thank you for the internet, which again, mine just crashed, so I don't have, most of my notes are there. But apparently in the 1400s, Portuguese people landed in Africa. And they got to understand that some of the people were in debt. Some of them didn't like living where they were. They convinced these people to get on the ship with them, and they would take them to a better land, to the Americas. And while they were there, they'd be able to work for land, and they'd have a better life. And so as they got on the ship and they got to other land, other countries, they were taken off the ship, they were put onto a platform, and that became the auction block. And they were turned into slaves. I didn't know this. And they were told that they were indentured servants, that if they would work for 7 years without any money, that ultimately they'd be able to have a certain amount of land. Well, how did they get here to America? They came to the East Coast, and ultimately they went to the South, and you remember the Civil War, and the years for the Civil War, 1860 what? 1 to 1865, and my great-grandfather was in the Civil War. He had dysentery so strong for the first 39 days he was there, they discharged him. He went home, got well, went back, re-enlisted. He learned how to play the bugle in an afternoon, and he woke the troops every morning at 4 a.m. for the rest of the time that he served. Okay, that was the Civil War. Well, back to the South. We have all this cotton being pulled by hand. The cotton gin is now making it faster and easier to pluck the cotton off from the plants. And so very soon, within the cotton value crop in the South was valued at $150,000. Within 10 years, it became valued at over $8 million because they were able to process so much more. Now, I had to go to the store or to the library and pick up this book, Hidden in Plain View, because it is about quilts and the information that the black slave women were embroidering and quilting into their quilts, so that they were giving information on how they would outline in quilting design the size of the plantation, and they would indicate the best place that somebody could try to escape from. And usually it would be in the spring, because here were the bears that were coming out of the hibernation. And so if they put a bear paw print on the fence or on the line to air, the masters of the house wanted their quilts aired. Well, they're hanging it on there, and that is indicating to the person who's trying to escape, follow bear tracks. He will lead you to food and water. If it was a monkey wrench, that meant start gathering the tools. If it was a wagon wheel quilt block, it meant that maybe there would be a wagon available. There was even a crossroads quilt block, and Ohio became a crossroad. You remember, we had free slaves up in the north. We had slaves in the south. Well, moving on then, they made even a story into a child's book, and this young woman by the name of Harriet Powers was born in October of 1837. She lived underneath a quilt frame as she was tiny. She listened to the gossip, and in those days, gossip was good because they were sharing recipes. They were sharing information about who just got married or who needs help building a barn, etc. So gossip was very good, but now it's taken on a worse connotation. She became enamored with what the women were doing with their hands, and ultimately she created a quilt from the Bible stories because she was taught out of the Bible, and created this quilt. A white woman saw this quilt and offered her $10 for it, and Harriet said, I just couldn't part with it. I'd be parting with part of my soul. And so she didn't. A couple of years later, major financial difficulty. Harriet had married. She had a couple of children. They had no money. And she went back to this woman and said, would you please pay me $10 for this quilt now? And the woman said, I can only afford $5. And so she sold it for $5. This quilt now hangs in a prominent museum in Washington, D.C. It is valued greatly because of its brilliance and its workmanship, etc. And it has become the grandmother of today's story quilts.
What's that book called?
It's called Hidden in Plain View. Absolutely phenomenal. The two authors have royally done their homework to find people who could still tell about it, and this is where the Underground Railroad comes into being. I have some quilts here that Janice and Jim Dixon have allowed me to bring, and they brought this picture. Janice loves to go to the Discount Tuesdays, garage sales, thrift shops, etc. And back in Alabama, wherever. Anyway, take a look at this picture. Look at the rows of cotton plants. And down below, of course, you will recognize the log cabin quilt pattern. Okay? And that's why cotton became so valuable, because it was easy to acquire, well, after the cotton gin was created, and then spun into thread. But the majority of the women who landed on the East Coast as pilgrims all became homemakers and processors of whatever was needed in order to cover. Okay, now the main reason that I wanted to share all this with you is because all the rules have changed for quilt making. I don't know if you're aware of that, but I am, and I'm not quite sure I can deal with that. I am a traditionalist. I don't want to do it the modern way. This was created by one of my neighbors. She had just simply sewn all these pieces together. She gave it to the artist, who is a long arm artist. The long arms are 144 inches long. The machine sits on a platform, and the machine moves clear across the fabric. They do not. What do I do? Put me back together here, quick. Am I all right? Can you still hear me? Okay. And so they're back to using 100% cotton batting, thin, flat, because they're literally flattening everything. She didn't like this, and so I put the binding on it, and I said, I need to use that in my next quilt lecture to show what I'm not crazy about. I much prefer the traditional way, okay? It is very flat. It still keeps you warm. All right, moving along then. Let's go back to, even though all of that, let's go back to the quilts that arrived here in America. As the pilgrims got off the boats, got onto shore, they brought with them what they wore on their bodies and what they could carry in their satchels. And as those fabrics started to wear out, they searched for the most unworn spots, and they created what is called the scrap bag. Remember, they were coming from countries where they'd already established blankets that are how many layers? One. Coverlets that are how many layers? Two. Duvet covers, that's a coverlet, okay? And then you put stuffing inside. And how many layers for a quilt? You're going to know that by the end of this day, okay? Moving along. In 1638, log cabins started being built. They would determine where the fireplace would be, and then the outline of the log cabin. Well, it wasn't too far after that it was important to put a log cabin quilt inside the log cabin on the bed. Therefore, the very first log cabins were created with a red center square. Half the block is dark for the shadow or nighttime, and half the block is light. Okay? If the center block was then changed to yellow, that meant it was the light in the window for the weary traveler. Isn't that great? So log cabin quilts have been here for a very long time. Now, as schoolhouses were created, and the one-room schoolhouses, and children were starting to learn thus and such and needed skills, every little boy and girl in the 4 years of age, or 5 or 6, whenever they started school, had to create what was called a 9-patch. This was so they could learn the importance of making their corners match. Why did the little boys have to learn? Well, they're going to have to repair shoes and harnesses and saddles and rope and whatever else they're going to have to repair, and the little girls are going to have to grow up and be sewing the clothing in order to put and keep everybody covered. This is my 9-patch sample, and it has a pattern here for each one of the different kinds of points that you can put on an edge. Prairie points, ruffle, etc. Okay? So we'll go on with that then. Put that down. This is the oldest quilt that I have. This was created in 1908. It is all hand quilted, total scraps, and it was created to go around my mother's porcelain doll. Please, my friends, understand that every single thing you have, your glasses, your clothes, the doorknob, has a history of how it got to be where it is today. And that's why all of you truly should be writing your own life history, because you've had events and experiences that nobody else has had. I want to point this out, important, that you can get age spots on your quilts. Every one of us has body oils, and you touch fabric, and if it isn't processed and cared for properly, age spots will arrive. So be conscious of that. This has a cotton batting in it, and notice that I have labeled it with my $3,000 Bernina sewing machine. We're going to talk about that in a minute, indicating that this is what was put around my mother's porcelain doll. Love to have that. Okay, now we have to go back to Martin Luther King because you saw that picture, but look at this. This is one of the quilts that Janice has found at her bargain basement gatherings. Is that amazing? And the little black people that are there, all right? I want to show you this. This is Trip Around the World. Please come and pick this up right here. This starts with a center square, and then this is the next journey, and the next journey, and the next journey. This was created in the 1930s. Notice the age spot, because somebody put hand lotion or something on their hand and then hand quilted it, etc. Please observe the hand quilting on here. This has a cotton bat in it. It had to be quilted this close together because bonded bats had not been put on the market yet. And if you didn't quilt at least an inch apart, even closer, it would be important so that the batting would not migrate and start pulling through the quilt. If you have a quilt at home that has fuzzballs on it, excuse me, I have a drink in that orange cup right there. As you're pulling off those fuzzballs, you are literally pulling the batting out from your quilt. So be conscious of that. Thank you, Julie. Okay, this is native to America. Now, our great-grandmothers had to walk down the path to get the bucket of water out of the stream to take it back in, to use it for the dirty dishes, etc. But she couldn't just throw it out the door. She had to plant flower seeds by the door, and then we could create grandmother's flower garden. This was all hand-pieced, put together, okay? And you see here that I have a label on each one of these. I have to have another drink. Thank you. I want to share this with you. There came a period of time when everyone wanted to have a double wedding ring quilt because of the story that went with it. As the female child was born, the mother would ask of each of her family and friends a scrap of fabric and create the first ring. As this child grew, additional rings were added to this quilt top. This was to be one in her dowry of 13, a baker's dozen that were to be hers when she got married. However, this quilt top was not to be quilted until that child was engaged, for fear it would be a bad omen and she would never marry. But more specifically, no two scraps in that quilt were to match, for fear it would rob that child of an experience in life. Come for just a minute, just hold this up here. Therefore, the only pieces of fabric that match are the cornerstones. There are over 2,000 pieces in this quilt. I heard the story. I had to cut for it. I was working at the Nettle Bernina in Salt Lake. I cut for 4 real double wedding rings. Gave one to my neighbor who was 40 years older than I. She hand-pieced the whole thing and hand-quilted it. My quilt addicts, too much is not enough. We quilted one. We put it in the auction for the raising money for the Primary Children's Hospital, and it brought $2,800. And then I had the fabric and put this together, and I just loved it, except that I just couldn't live with it anymore, and so I put it out in a garage sale, and my neighbor bought it right as he was running down the street to walk his dog. He said, "What's that?" And I told him the history of it. And he said, "I have to have that." Now here is a fabric pocket. I used to take my piece of fabric, scotch tape it to a piece of typing paper, and run it through my electric typewriter and type the history on fabric. But then the electric typewriter went away because I went into computers, so I can't do that anymore because computers won't do that. And so now I type on paper and just hope that the person with the quilt will remember to remove it before they wash the quilt. Please, please know that if you have a quilt that was made before World War II, it cannot go to the dry cleaners. The fabrics before World War II, most of them are 100% cottons, but anything before World War II is not processed for the chemicals in the dry cleaners. And I even know quilts that have gotten lost when they were taken to be dry cleaned because somebody recognized their value and walked off with them. So be very conscious of what you're doing. Let's go back here to this. Back to Janice and Jim and their quilts. Hold this up, Julie, please. This is what we call a quilt top. Please observe that this has all been hand-pieced. You're welcome to come up and look at this. Most curious, Janice doesn't make quilts, and neither does Jim. But she loves them, and she has over 50 of them, and she told me this at a luncheon last month, and I had to go see them, and that's why she's been willing to bring these, to show these to us. This, then, is postage stamp. And you remember the mail, and you remember the Pony Express. Well, if you're going to have postage stamps, why not make a quilt to match the postage stamps? How about that? All right, now, during all of this, then, we have a huge history of dolls. And we had this little cherub arrive on the quilt, and it's called the Sunbonnet Sue. She's faceless. She does not ever show her face, but she has morphed into a young lady with her toe is pointed out. She's carrying a parasol, but she is still faceless and just with a big sunbonnet. Well, here's this wonderful quilt that Janice happened to find, and she's paying $4 or $5 for these. These are people who did not put a label on the back of their quilt, and it ended up in a garage sale or something because nobody knew the history of the quilt. Please write your labels. So then put them on your treasured. So here's your Sunbonnet Sue, here's your wagon wheel, or you need to know that any quilt pattern can have upwards of 20 names. The name of a quilt pattern is a wreath, it can be a wagon wheel, it can be several other things. The Lone Star of Texas has 20 different names. The name of a quilt changed every 10 miles or 10 years, depending on how fast it came across the United States as the United States expanded. Well, if you're going to do a sunbonnet female, doesn't she have to have a male companion? And so let's show him, and he is called Overall Bill. Is he darling? Is he faceless? He's faceless. Absolutely amazing. Okay, moving on then. The women were getting so excited about all of these different quilt patterns that they had to start putting them together because they wanted to remember all of them. And so they started creating what is called a sampler quilt. And so this is a sampler quilt showing you how different all the patterns look, and yet all of them have the same fabrics. How do you like that? Oh, you're saying all the right things. Applique was one of the ways to do quilts. This is called reverse applique, and it was taken from the Sangloss, from the Kuna Indians on the Sangloss Islands, where they will take upwards of 13 layers of fabric, cut down to the layer that they want to expose, and turn everything back under. And so that was a reverse applique. Instead of putting something on top, they're cutting down to it and then moving it back there. Okay? Moving on then. We have to go back to my notes because I'm just so excited about this I can hardly stand it. The only thing that I have found in history as I've been doing all of this is the fact that in 1838 to 1839, for 5 months, Joseph Smith was in Liberty Jail. And he wrote one letter to his wife, Emma, and said, please, could you send us a quilt? We are freezing. And she wrote back and said, I'm sorry. The mob has stolen all of our quilts. Quilts have been highly favored, treasured, needed in order to maintain health and livelihood, okay? You need to know that in 1851, the very first sewing machine that appeared on American soil was created by a Mr. Singer. Singer sewing machines. And you need to also understand that the very first payment plan was also offered. And look how far payment plan has lasted. Is that an amazing piece of history? Okay? In 1853, just 2 years later, Levi Strauss, who was born in Bavaria, has landed in California in the heart of the gold rush. And all of a sudden, he starts to recognize how fast the dungarees, the men's pants, are wearing out. And he starts processing all of that, and he likes fabric, and so he decides that he's going to create a piece of fabric that will be stronger. I don't know that you can be an American if you don't have a pair of Levi's, at least in your closet. So here's this Levi quilt, okay? Total scraps, completely worn out. Well, this quilt was I was asked to create this quilt for the Modern Makeovers display for 1 year in the General Relief Society building up in Salt Lake City. And as I was putting it together, I came across this flour sack. Now, during the Depression, which was when?
We can't see it. She needs to show it.
Needs to turn it, sorry?
My fault.
You can do this, all right? The flour sacks, salt sacks, and sugar sacks were being put in a piece of fabric with a chain stitch down the one side and across the bottom so that those receiving the sacks could empty the contents, pull the chain stitch, and it would open up this bigger piece of fabric in order to make clothing. So that was a way to help things. Well, just as I was finishing this, notice here I have a pocket. It even says rags on here, and the rivets are here because Levi Strauss patented the rivets to be on the pockets to hold the pockets in place to keep them from wearing out, or etc. And as I was just finishing it, my daughter came in the room and said, I don't want my skirt anymore, it's too small. And I said, great. And I immediately removed the cricket that was down there on the bottom of the skirt, okay, and put that on there. And then I had to go to an egg convention, and my husband was in charge of 3.5 million chickens, and they had to find a way to process and take care of the flies that fly around chickens on egg processing ranches, etc. And as I walked by, this man handed me an embroidered fly that he put on my name tag, and I said, thank you. And he said, you're the only person who's ever said thank you for an embroidered fly. And I said, I make quilts, and you always have flies at picnics. I'm going to put this on my next picnic quilt. He said, here, and he gave me a whole sheet of them. So all the flies. So you need to know that for 1 year, there was a cricket and 2 flies in the general building up in Salt Lake City. We'll just leave it right there. Thank you very much. Okay? Then, in 1980, I was in the basement of the Bountiful Library, and I was attending a quilt presentation on how to use up strings and do string piecing. This is string piecing, where you piece things together and make your designs. And during that presentation, the presenter said, and tied quilts. Well, you know, they tied the very first quilts here on American soil, which they did. They tied it with cording or whatever they could find, process, and just tied it in order to get bedding onto the beds and keep warm. But she said tied quilts really don't count. They don't matter. And I thought, I don't think that's fair. I started out making my first tied quilt, and so I went home, did some research, and found out there was no book on the market on tied quilts. And so I wrote it.
We have a comment from Terry Ann online.
Okay?
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Terry
Terry
Ann.
Ann? Are we going to hear from her?
No, I have nothing, but I love this whole discussion. I'm sorry I hit the raised hand when I shouldn't have. So
Okay,
thank you, Claire. It's
Yeah.
wonderful.
I wrote my book called Tie It, You'll Like It. And how to make elegant tied quilts. You put the ties on the back side. You only allow people to stand at the head and the foot of the quilt so that there are not ties going all the way around the quilt. All the ties go in the same direction. It'll be more elegant, and you are not adding a dimension of busy to what is already busy. So the very first time I gave a quilt lecture just after creating this, I took it and I showed it, okay? And I showed that the ties were on the back side and that I had also hand quilted around the embroidered design on the top side. And this woman came up afterwards and she said, "You can't do that." And I said, "What?" And she said, "You cannot hand quilt and tie on a quilt." And I said, "What is your scripture and verse?" Well, you just don't. It's my quilt. I can do what I want, and that's the beauty of quilts. You can do just what you want, so don't let anybody tell you you can't. Well, every one of you had a great-grandmother who had a gingham apron, because gingham was a big piece of fabric at one point in time, and it made wonderful aprons, because then you couldn't see the spots of the grease and everything else splattering on them. And so we took the 1-inch gingham. We tied dark yarn in white squares and white yarn in dark squares, and we created this optical illusion. And as I showed this, one man accused me of spray painting the fabric. I did not. Now, I have to sing the praises for all the wonderful presenters for ElderQuest. You will remember that Martin Pond showed us that video of Utah's famous firsts and told us about Philo Farnsworth and how he had made furrows, and he watched the energy coming up off the furrows, which led him to create the what? The television. Well, back to Log Cabin, this is called Fields and Furrows, okay, in commemoration for that, all right? Now, during one period of time, some of the women wanted to find out how they could contain the quilt but still put it on their couch, so we made quillos. And we actually have a quilt inside of the pillow, so that's a quillo. I bring your attention to, how are we doing on time? Great. Okay. 50 years ago, 1976, it is time for the bicentennial quilt contest, and I wanted to enter. And so I was the Blazer Scout leader. I had just taken all my little boys over to have their fingerprinting merit badge and learned that everybody has an original pair of handprints and fingerprints. Well, what's more original than getting handprints? So I sent a letter to all these people. There are 47 handprints on there. Now, what size should the block be? Well, my husband and our 6 children and my handprint are on the bottom row, and my husband's hand was huge, so that's the size that we made the quilt blocks. I wrote a letter to all these people. I have Gerald Ford, who was the President of the United States. I have Spencer W. Kimball, President of the LDS Church. I have LeGrand Richards, who's actually sat in my dining room table because my father took care of his medical needs when he came down to California. I went to John Mikesell, the school crossing guard. Okay? And I said, could I please trace your right hand? And he said, why? And I said, because you get my children to school every day safely. You are a special person in my life helping to take care of my children. And I'm going to put it right next to John Wayne's handprint. Mr. Mike is what we called him, and he wept. And I put him right next to John Wayne. Now I have to tell you that my husband was thrilled to know that his handprint was bigger than John Wayne's. Because he idolized John Wayne and God, not necessarily in that order. Okay? Now, if you'll zero in on what is the history of our American flag. Well, we always thought it was Betsy Ross, but AI and internet and all that has said that we're not quite sure she did the first one. She was making flags for the Navy ship. We do know that George Washington went to her and said, I would like a national flag, and I'd like it to be a 6-pointed star, and she said it would look better with a 5-pointed star. And she folded the fabric, cut it, opened it up, and he agreed. And so we came up with, that's the history of our 5-pointed star on our American flag, okay? This is the actual waistband and seam and pockets from my daughter's corduroy pants. I raised our 6 children with 7 German Shepherds, not all at the same time, so that's there. I Pledge Allegiance is done in trapunto, which is a type of quilt process where you put 2 layers together, you slit the underneath layer, you stuff it to make it raise, and then you close that up and then you quilt around it. Trapunto quilting, what's that called? Trapunto quilting. Probably never heard that before, probably never say it, very seldom ever used again.
Claire?
Anyway, they're all the handprints.
We have a comment from Connie online this time.
Speak, Connie, quick.
Take your microphone off mute, Connie. She has lowered her hand.
She took it down. Okay, moving along then. That's my bicentennial quilt, and that's the main reason I wanted to give this quilt show, was to be able to show it one more time, because my daughter wants to claim John Wayne's handprint and her dad's to put on her wall, okay? So we're going to let her do that. All right. Now,
Okay, now, can you hear me now?
That bicentennial.
There's your Connie.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, the one thing I wanted to say is I've quilted for many years, and the biggest lesson I learned is there is no such thing as a quilt police. So it doesn't matter what anybody thinks about tying quilts, any type you want to do is just fine, because we don't have a quilt police. So if anybody complains about your quilt, tell them to go get the police.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Okay, you need to know that the native quilt to the state of Utah is the tricot quilt. Did any of you have a tricot quilt or make one? Okay. Tricot, it was wonderful. It was produced right here in the area. It was mostly for lingerie, silky fabric for pajamas, etc. And so we started taking the big pieces, putting it together. We would trace a design into the quilt top, and most often it had an LDS temple in the middle. It was wonderful. A couple of things had created a problem. In all things, there's opposition. It was so silky that as you put it on the bed and slept under it and turned over, it slid right off on the floor. The other situation with the temple in the middle of the quilt, the temple became too sacred and should not be in the middle of a quilt for people to be sitting down on it or dropping their luggage or something else, and so it came and went. We have very, very few quilts here in the state of Utah. Why? Because the LDS women were very frugal, and when the quilt started wearing out, they'd find a way to put a top and a bottom on it and tie it, and then they'd have another quilt, but their quilt inside was actually the batting at that time. Or the rag man came through town and needed rags, because then those fabrics were mulched and created into newspaper, and that's why the newspaper was called the rag sheet. Now, isn't that an interesting piece of information? Okay, well, that was done in 1976. 9,954 quilts were submitted for that quilt contest. How would you like to be on that judging committee? They were submitted by slide, not in the flesh. Anybody making slide pictures today? Do you see the history that we've just marched through? It's just phenomenal to me. We keep making it better, hopefully, than what we just had. And so my quilt was submitted. It was placed second from the state of Utah. It did not win. That's just fine. But those that did win were highly acclaimed, and we were thrilled to celebrate that. Okay, jumping forward to 1985, the ominous they, have decided to scrub the Statue of Liberty. She's dirty. She'd been there a long time raising her torch, and she needs to have a facelift. And everybody was invited to send in a box top from some cereal and $1 at least to help with the scrubbing. And they had another quilt contest. The most interesting thing is that they made the rules so rigid, even though we had probably 4 times as many quilters going on in that 10-year period of time here in the United States, just under 1,000 quilts were submitted. Well, I had just moved to my home, and I wanted to have a brick wall quilt to put on the wall to indicate all the brick walls I was running into with my genealogy research that I was trying to climb over, etc. And so all of this red is from scraps that people had given me that were in my scrap bag. Okay, here is the United States. Love it or leave it. And boy, I wish there were a few who were, you know, free to be me. Aren't we thrilled to be free? And this represents the freedom. This has 21 statements on it. We are free to speak our minds. Aren't we grateful for that freedom? Mickey Mouse, because we are a young state. Belt your loved ones. That was a commercial because seat belts had just come into the cars and we had to belt our loved ones. Okay? There's no place like home. In God we trust. Where's the beef? Do you remember that commercial? One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Walking on the moon. Do you know there are still people who don't believe that really happened? They think we have made it all up. Old quilters never die, they just go to pieces. E.T., phone home, phone home. We're all glad when our children remembered to phone home. Liberty rings clear. Do not bend, fold, staple, or mutilate. We used to get that on packages, etc. I pledge. Count the times between now and the 4th of July that you have the privilege to stand up, just like last Wednesday to our luncheon, and pledge allegiance and stand up a little bit taller, because we have the grandest land in the whole world. And then, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. Snafu, situation normal, all fouled up. And down here, the unknown soldier, lest we forget. Okay? And so that is my quilt that I love making and have enjoyed using. Okay, now, heading into the home stretch here, and we're doing just great. I have 4 minutes. In 1982, all the eyes of the world were on Salt Lake City. Barney Clark was dying, and he had finally agreed that he would be the guinea pig, literally, to have the very first Jarvik artificial heart implanted in his body. He was going to die anyway. He was going to take a chance. I am in awe, with great reverence, taught to me by my father, of this human body that we have. My father was a urologist. Consider, we cut our skin and it knits itself back together. We cut fabric, you got to figure out how to put it back together with Singer sewing machine on the payment plan. I did say that, okay? And so I was heavily involved with the Utah Quilt Guild. We wanted to have an original quilt showing, and so 3 in the morning I woke and I had this idea. The Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz needed a real heart. Could he not bring an artificial heart to Barney Clark, running down the yellow brick road to Salt Lake City? Yes, I got up, I wrote it down on paper, because you always do that if you get a special inspiration in the middle of the morning. Otherwise, when you wake up, you forget. I got back into bed. Gray fabric is gray. Where on earth am I going to find silver fabric? A couple of days later, the phone rings, and this man says, Claire, I understand that you do things with, oh, brothers, I left something out. Well, we'll go back to that in a minute. You do something with fabric? I said, that's with quilts. I said, yes. He brought me a piece of fabric, and he said, please see if this could be used for quilt batting inside of quilts. I said, tell me about it. He said, we're trying to come up with a fabric that's going to help the astronauts go into outer space. Because as they go into outer space, they're sitting in puddles of perspiration. We're trying to find a fabric that would maintain 80% of their body heat and 20% of evaporation for their perspiration. He handed this fabric and held it up to the light. It has 1 million holes per square inch in it. And so I hand quilted it, I machine quilted it, I tied it, I slept under it. It rustles. Did you want to sleep under a noisy quilt? He came back, picked up all of my findings that I had documented, and I said, what are you going to do with that extra piece of fabric? He said, you may have it, and there's my Tin Man running down the Yellow Brick Road. Now the Tin Man is unique in that he is appliqued on top of a quilt, so it's a quilt on top of a quilt, because I put a backing on him, and then I entered it into the Springville Quilt Contest. They did not have a category for quilt on a quilt, and so I got an honorable mention for being most unique. The other unique thing is that at the very base of the rainbow is the outline of the City of Oz. Many times, as in this 2026 semi-quincentennial, say it, semi-quincentennial year, we need to look backward into history to recognize really how far we have come, okay? Now, the rest of the story, Barney Clark is coming out of the anesthesia. It is a success. His wife is standing right beside him. Everybody's cheering across the world. He opens his eyes and he says to his wife, I love you. And she said, you do? And he said, yes, I do. I was concerned with an artificial heart. I wouldn't, and I still wanted to. Now look at the history that we just discovered in that. Okay, I have to go back to this. Back to the Sunbonnet Sue and Overall Bill. It was so popular that a quilt group in Kansas in 1976 said, we've had it, and they found 20 ways to kill her off. She's swallowed by a snake, she's hit by a skylab, she's tied up on the railroad tracks. You may come up and look at that. You need to know, as I stated, that every 10 miles or 10 years they change the name of a quilt. Okay, well, you need to know that the Dolly Madison Star is the only quilt pattern that was never changed. Why? Prime example. First of all, her name is spelled 3 different ways, D-O-L-L-Y, E-Y, or L-L-I-E. So please write your history, write down how to spell your name, and leave it one way only. Nevertheless, Dolly Madison served in the White House as the hostess for President Thomas Jefferson because his wife had died and they needed a female hostess. She's the one that started inviting the Republicans and the Democrats to the White House to mingle socially to see if they couldn't be kinder to each other. She was then the first lady as her husband, James Madison, became the President of the United States, 1809 to 1817. The War of 1812 began. The British were coming again. They were ready to burn down the White House in August of 1814. Dolly turned back, got her helpers to crush the glass case and remove the full statue painting of George Washington, and then she picked up a copy of the Declaration of Independence and headed out the door as the White House was torched. She also became the first citizen to transmit a message via telegraph, an honor given her by the inventor Samuel Morse. How about that? Okay. 1979, a man in Japan decided to take the pizza cutter and add a better blade to it and make it into a rotary cutter. Has a guard on it, so you expose the guard, otherwise it's safety so that you're not going to cut it. He thought it would be wonderful for people who had to give up sewing because they could no longer open and close scissors because of arthritis. It exploded our quilt industry. We used to have for 150 years 150 designs to the log cabin. We now have thousands of designs for the log cabin, except that the big problem was this only cut 8 layers of fabric at one time. We needed a bigger blade. We can cut 16 layers of fabric at one time. We literally, and I did it with numerous students, we cut up all the fabric for a king-size log cabin quilt in 20 minutes instead of 4 days. Is that phenomenal?
Claire?
Yes.
We have 3 messages online. Let me just share them with you if I could. From Terry Ann. An announcement just went out from Williamsburg 250 inviting a quilt block from anyone that wants to enter. It's visitwilliamsburg.com.
Thank you very much. Anybody want to do that? Join. Have a good time.
There you go. And then it's a 250th birthday quilt. Quilt, a piece of history. She shared the webpage. Just go ahead and do a Google search. Quilt, a piece of history. You'll find more information on that.
Okay.
And then the last one is a kudo to you, and I'll read it. Claire Petersen is fantastic. I love her passion for the things she shares. Thank you for having her. As a fellow quilter, I love this presentation. There's a heart and there's a spindle. Don't let it go to your head, but congratulations, young lady.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Okay, with the rotary cutter then, we didn't want to cut out individual pieces and then have to piece them back together. We even revolutionized that. We did what was called string piecing or strip piecing. We would sew strips of fabric together. We would then take our template, which is now plastic since World War II, cut across those rows, and we've formed rows of squares without ever having cut a square. So now back to the trip around the world that was native to America. A beginner can sew the strips together, cut across them, create the whole quilt top in 13 hours or less. Is that amazing? And so, dear people, you need to know, several of you have attended my Demise Desires presentation that I've given a couple of times. I want you to know that I really would like to take some of my talent with me. This is my body bag. This is going to save me a minimum of $1,000 because I do not have to have a casket inside the cement vault that the Orem City Cemetery requires when I die. Okay, and this fabric, do you see the lumps and the bumps? That's for the lumps and bumps of life that each one of us endures and lives through and makes better. And these are scraps of fabric left over from having made pajamas and clothes for my children. Just maybe I'll be able to take some of it with me. My one daughter decided when she had her first child that we all needed to be chickens because my husband again was in charge of 3.5 million chickens. And so we're all chickens here. It was a sweatshirt. Well, I don't like people reading my chest. And so I cut it up and I put it on here, and just maybe I can take some of this with me. So, with all my heart, thank you for listening to this presentation on fabric. And the next time you walk into the store, thrift shop, or whatever, and you're ready to buy something, consider what did it take for that to be hanging on this hanger that I can put my money, and money has its own history, in order to put it on my back. Thank you for letting me share with you.